Hello, my friends. The trap most people fall into is thinking these are separate incidents. A tanker chased in the Caribbean is filed under Latin America news. A sanctions bill in Washington is filed under domestic politics. A weapons package for Ukraine is filed under European security. A press leak about peace talks is filed under diplomacy. And because the filing cabinet in our heads has neat little drawers, the machine gets to operate with maximum freedom. It can squeeze here, escalate there, backpedal somewhere else while the public never sees the whole mechanism in motion. But the mechanism is the story. At its core, this is an empire managing stress. Not the cartoon version where everything is omnipotent and perfectly planned. No empire is. This is a system that has grown used to setting the rules and now discovers that rule setting is being contested not by one country, but by reality itself, by alternative markets, alternative supply chains, alternative security arrangements, and the sheer stubborn fact that large states with resources and industrial capacity do not collapse on command. So the machine leans harder, and that leaning has a signature. It goes after what is tangible, interruptible, and globally dependent. Trade, shipping, finance, insurance, ports, the connective tissue of the modern world. That's why the tanker episode matters so much for the Russia-Ukraine war, even if the map looks unrelated. Because the Ukraine war is not just artillery and trenches. It is also a global test of whether the West can enforce compliance through the plumbing of the world economy. When sanctions on Russia didn't produce the political outcome that had been promised, when Russia adapted, rerouted, found buyers, increased production, hardened its systems, the next logical step for the coercion toolkit is to get more physical, more direct, more intimidating. If the spreadsheet doesn't break the target, you start threatening the supply chain itself. And the Caribbean is a laboratory for that. Think about what a high seas interception really communicates. It is not merely a tactic, it is a message. Your cargo is not yours if we can reach it. Your flag can be challenged. Your paperwork can be investigated. Your route can be turned into a gauntlet. Your commercial life can be translated into a security problem at will. It's coercion that wears a uniform and claims it's law. Now bring that back to Ukraine. In the Ukraine conflict, the West has tried to weaponize everything short of a direct NATO-Russia shooting war. Freezing reserves, energy price caps, secondary sanctions, industrial restrictions, propaganda saturation, diplomatic pressure on neutral states, and the constant promise that the next package will be the one that changes everything. What that produced instead was a different kind of evolution. Russia treated it like a prolonged siege and responded in the oldest rational way by building redundancy and endurance. The longer this goes, the clearer the asymmetry becomes. Time hurts the West's narrative more than it hurts Russia's fundamentals. Western publics are sold a story of imminent victory, and then they are asked to fund indefinite war. European industry pays higher energy costs while being told this is strategic. Governments talk about sovereignty while outsourcing key decisions to alliance discipline. And in the middle sits Ukraine, whose people pay the highest price while the strategic architecture around them is designed to keep the larger machine running. This is where the talk of peace processes becomes almost darkly comic. Because what does peace mean in a system that needs crisis to justify itself? NATO is not merely an alliance, it is also an institution with budgets, procurement cycles, political careers, think tank ecosystems, and an entire worldview built around perpetual threat. A true off-ramp doesn't just end a war. It threatens the narrative glue that keeps the coalition aligned. If the crisis ends, the questions start. If the questions start, the legitimacy wobbles. If the legitimacy wobbles, budgets and influence follow. So peace is always dangled, never delivered. You get meetings and statements, but the pipeline continues. You get diplomatic choreography, but the strategic goal remains. Keep Russia pressured, keep Europe dependent, keep the US central. And here's the part people hate saying out loud. In that setup, Ukraine's sovereignty becomes rhetorical. Ukraine is the battleground where larger actors negotiate leverage. That doesn't mean Ukrainians lack courage or agency in their own lives. It means the war's strategic direction is not primarily decided in Kiev. It is decided by the capitals that pay and supply and by the domestic politics inside those capitals. That is why the only party with no real power to decide is Ukraine. Not because Ukrainians are powerless as human beings, but because the structure of patronage war makes the client state dependent. Dependency is not a moral insult. It's a mechanical fact. And Russia understands this. Russia does not need to win every news cycle. Russia needs to win the structural contest. Industrial endurance, battlefield attrition, and strategic restraint. The West keeps trying to provoke a dramatic emotional escalation, something that can be turned into a moralized rallying cry. Russia's incentive is to deny that gift. Keep the war ugly but controlled. Keep the pace steady. Keep production high. Keep manpower sustainable. Keep diplomacy available. And let the coalition on the other side exhaust itself in contradictions. This is what a long war does. It reveals which systems are built for endurance and which are built for performance. Now, zoom back out to the tanker story and the China angle, because this is where things start to sharpen into a global fork in the road. If cargo linked to Chinese buyers can be interfered with under thin legal pretexts, then China faces a strategic dilemma: respond strongly and risk escalation, or respond weakly and risk encouraging repeat behavior. Strategic patience works brilliantly until it doesn't, until it becomes predictability that the opponent exploits. The entire art of deterrence is convincing your opponent that certain lines carry costs. And Washington, by testing the edges, flag validity, jurisdiction, ambiguity, sanctions enforcement, is trying to discover where China's lines actually are. This is a dangerous game because it creates a world where commerce becomes hostage-taking by another name. If states conclude that their legal contracts are meaningless when confronted with a helicopter and a boarding team, then global trade stops being a neutral system and starts being a security contest that accelerates decoupling, militarizes logistics, and makes miscalculation easier. In that world, the Ukraine war is not the only fire. It's the model, it's the template for how coercion will be applied elsewhere. Energy, transport, insurance, and access. And once you accept that template, you are admitting that the future is not governed by rules, but by power, power that is increasingly contested. Which leads us to the cold conclusion, the one nobody wants printed on a campaign poster. The U as NATO bloc struggles to stop because stopping is an admission of limits. If the machine admits limits in Ukraine, it invites tests elsewhere. It invites doubt among allies. It invites political backlash at home. So it keeps moving, even if the moves become more desperate, more brazen, more legally acrobatic. Russia doesn't need to rush because its strategic position improves with endurance. Every month that passes without Russia collapsing under sanctions is a month that teaches neutral states a lesson. The West cannot dictate outcomes as easily as it claims. Every adaptation Russia demonstrates becomes a manual for others. And every Western escalation outside the battlefield, economic, maritime, legal intimidation, chips away at the very legitimacy the West claims to defend. Ukraine, caught in the gears, is the one actor that cannot simply choose to end the war on its own terms. It can choose to fight, to endure, to negotiate, but it cannot unilaterally change the strategic incentives of the sponsors that have turned this war into a pillar of their broader posture. That is the brutal geometry of it. Now, if you want the truly uncomfortable layer, the more the West expands coercion into shipping and global trade, the more it creates exactly the multipolar acceleration it claims to fear. Coercion preserves dominance only when it is used sparingly and credibly. Overuse turns it into a recruitment tool for alternatives. It pushes states that would otherwise prefer neutrality into building parallel systems, parallel payment rails, parallel insurance, parallel security arrangements. The empire tightens the screws to hold the world together, and by tightening, it fractures the world faster. So, when you hear another press statement about de-escalation, ask yourself, what is actually being de-escalated? A sentence or the machine? Because the machine doesn't de-escalate with words. It de-escalates when it meets costs. And right now the system is probing to see where the costs begin on the battlefield, on the oceans, in the banks, in the supply chains, and in the political stamina of its own population. That's the real countdown. Not to some cinematic climax, but to a threshold. the point where coercion stops being an advantage and starts becoming a self-inflicted strategic wound. And once that threshold is crossed, the headlines won't matter. The world will already have changed underneath them. There is a final illusion that still comforts many observers: the belief that escalation is a choice freely made, that restraint is always available if leaders simply decide to be wiser. That illusion collapses once you understand how systems behave when they enter decline management mode. At that stage, restraint is no longer a virtue, it becomes a liability. Every pause looks like weakness. Every compromise looks like retreat. Every limit acknowledged becomes an invitation for pressure elsewhere. This is the psychological prison the United States and its alliance network now inhabit. In Ukraine, the initial wager was simple and arrogant: apply overwhelming financial pressure, isolate Russia diplomatically, flood Ukraine with weapons, and wait for Moscow to crack economically, politically, socially. When that didn't happen, the narrative had to be constantly updated without admitting the wager had failed. So the war became rebranded, then reframed, then morally absolutized. Each reframe narrowed the exit options. Once a conflict is sold as existential, walking it back becomes politically radioactive. That is why every peace initiative sounds hollow, not because peace is impossible in theory, but because peace would require acknowledging that the original assumptions were wrong. It would require explaining to voters why billions were spent, why industries were disrupted, why Europe absorbed long-term energy pain, only to end up negotiating with the same adversary on terms less favorable than those available earlier. Systems hate admitting sunk costs. Empires hate it even more. So escalation creeps sideways. If you can't escalate directly against Russia without risking catastrophic confrontation, you escalate indirectly by tightening pressure on its partners, its customers, its trade routes, its insurance channels, its logistics. And if that still doesn't deliver obedience, you test how far physical coercion can go without triggering retaliation. Hence the maritime theater, hence the tankers, hence the normalization of actions that a decade ago would have been called what they are. This matters because maritime trade is not just another domain, it is the circulatory system of globalization. Once that system is politicized and weaponized openly, trust erodes at a scale no press conference can repair. Insurance premiums rise, routes change. Contracts get hedged against political risk. States begin asking whether relying on Western-controlled choke points is compatible with sovereignty. From Moscow's perspective, this dynamic is almost perversely clarifying. Russia does not need to convince the world with speeches. It only needs to survive and adapt. Every time coercion overshoots, every time a seizure looks arbitrary, every time law looks selective, it validates Russia's long-standing argument that the current order is not rules-based but power-based. And nothing accelerates multipolar alignment faster than lived experience. Countries do not abandon a system because of ideology. They abandon it because it becomes unreliable. Ukraine, tragically, sits inside this experiment rather than observing it. Its battlefield sacrifices are real. Its losses are real. But strategically, the war has been elevated into a function that serves external needs: maintaining alliance cohesion, disciplining Europe, signaling resolve to rivals, justifying military-industrial expansion. That does not require malice from every individual involved. The systems don't need villains, they need incentives. And the incentive structure here rewards continuation far more than resolution. This is why the most honest description of Ukraine's position is also the most uncomfortable. It is the party with the least control over the endgame. Not because Ukrainians lack will, but because the war's continuation is now entangled with forces that extend far beyond Ukrainian territory. The longer this persists, the more Kiev's choices narrow to variations of endurance rather than genuine strategic alternatives. Russia, by contrast, retains something crucial: the ability to wait. Waiting is not passivity. Waiting is strategy when time degrades your opponent's coherence faster than it degrades yours. Western societies are optimized for consumption, stability, and short political cycles. Long wars corrode consensus. They expose class tensions. They strain budgets. They create fatigue that no amount of moral rhetoric can permanently mask. Russia, having already absorbed the shock of sanctions and restructured its economy accordingly, now operates in a different temporal register. This asymmetry of time, patience, and expectations is decisive, and it connects directly back to the maritime coercion we're witnessing. Because when a power starts treating tankers like bargaining chips, it is no longer operating from confidence. It is probing for leverage because leverage elsewhere has diminished. That is not strength. That is stress behavior. China understands this instinctively, which is why its response, so far restrained, should not be misread as indifference. Strategic patience is not submission, it is sequencing. But there is a threshold beyond which patience becomes permission. And Washington is edging dangerously close to testing whether China will allow its commercial lifelines to be treated as expendable collateral in someone else's pressure campaign. If China concludes that restraint merely invites repetition, the global consequences will be severe and irreversible. Maritime security will fragment. Trade blocs will harden. The assumption that oceans are neutral highways will die. And once that assumption dies, the costs of miscalculation rise exponentially. This is the paradox. The current order cannot escape. It uses coercion to preserve stability, but the coercion itself destroys the conditions that make stability possible. At that point, narratives stop working. You can't spin your way out of structural distrust. You can't sanction your way back to legitimacy. And you certainly can't lecture the world about sovereignty while treating it as conditional. So when analysts ask, why doesn't the West stop? The answer is not ideological blindness alone. It is systemic inertia. Stopping would mean confronting decline, honestly. It would mean accepting a world where power is shared rather than enforced. It would mean abandoning the belief that every challenge can be managed through escalation disguised as law. And when people ask, why doesn't Russia hurry? The answer is equally unromantic. Because haste benefits the side that needs a decisive narrative victory. Endurance benefits the side that can live with ambiguity while its opponent cannot. As for Ukraine, the tragedy is that it is paying the price of this mismatch, not just in territory or infrastructure, but in agency. The longer the war persists as a pillar of someone else's strategy, the harder it becomes to reclaim ownership of its outcome. This is not cynicism. It is mechanics. Empires under stress don't suddenly become wiser. They become louder, more insistent, more coercive, and more convinced that one more push will restore control. But history is merciless with systems that mistake pressure for legitimacy. And that is the quiet, unsettling truth behind all of this, from the trenches of Ukraine to the decks of tankers on open seas. The conflict is no longer about winning in the traditional sense. It is about who can endure the unraveling of an order without panicking first. That is where the real battle is being fought. As the year draws to a close, it is useful to pause and compare where things stood a year ago with where they stand now. The difference between 2024 and 2025 is not merely one of time passing, it is a difference in political posture, strategic reality, and rhetorical desperation. Two factors define this shift. The first is the reemergence of Donald Trump as a central actor in discussions involving Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. The second is the radical escalation in European rhetoric, which has now reached a level that borders on strategic incoherence. In 2024, European rhetoric was loud, aggressive, and often disconnected from battlefield realities. In 2025, however, it has mutated into something more dangerous, a mix of denial, entitlement, and moral absolutism, entirely divorced from power. This change is not cosmetic. It reflects the slow recognition that the assumptions underpinning Europe's Ukraine policy have collapsed, even as European leaders publicly refuse to admit it. The central question surrounding the renewed diplomatic activity is simple. Are these negotiations bringing the war in Ukraine closer to a peaceful resolution? The operative word here is peaceful. On that front, there is little evidence of progress. What has emerged instead is a prolonged exercise in stating what has been obvious for a long time. Russia articulates its position clearly. Ukraine does the same from its own perspective. Europe, meanwhile, remains immobile, locked into maximalist positions it can neither enforce nor abandon. This is why these negotiations resemble a ritualized declaration of the obvious rather than a serious peace process. That said, there is a narrow silver lining. The very act of talking has forced some policymakers and commentators to confront reality, even if reluctantly. But that realization remains far from translating into policy. Notably, some of the most extreme and detached statements have emerged after negotiations began. This is not a criticism of Donald Trump personally. It is simply an observable pattern. As the possibility of an end to the war becomes imaginable, rhetorical excess increases, particularly from Kiev. This brings us to Volodymyr Zelensky's recent statements, which deserve close scrutiny because they reveal the strategic fantasy at the heart of Ukraine's current position. Zelensky has openly stated that Ukraine cannot independently finance an army of 800,000 troops, and that continued external funding is therefore necessary. He frames this as a security guarantee, arguing that Ukraine's armed forces are its primary safeguard. This assertion contains an unspoken assumption that Ukraine will emerge from the war with both the right and the capacity to maintain such a force. This assumption is profoundly unrealistic. Historically, when two neighboring states go to war and one loses, the victor does not allow the defeated side to retain a massive standing army. There is no precedent for this. The only scenario in which Ukraine could maintain an 800,000 strong force after the war is one in which Russia suffers a decisive and unmistakable defeat. There is no evidence that such an outcome is remotely plausible. On the contrary, Russian forces continue to advance along multiple sectors of the front. Ukrainian counterattacks exist, but they are localized, tactical, and insufficient to alter the strategic balance. This is not a matter of opinion. It is the observable reality of the battlefield. Equally important is the financial question. Zelensky speaks of appealing to global leaders, but he does not explain who exactly would be capable or willing to finance such an army indefinitely. The silence here is telling. As negotiations inch forward, such statements become more frequent, not less. They are not confidence signals. They are bargaining bluffs designed to anchor expectations far above what reality allows. Zelensky's remarks on territorial settlement follow the same pattern. He suggests that a fair outcome would involve both sides remaining where they are, freezing the current line of contact until diplomacy resolves the rest. In abstract moral terms, this may sound reasonable. In strategic terms, it is detached from power. Wars do not end because one side wishes time would stop. They end because one side imposes its will, or because both sides reach exhaustion at comparable levels. Ukraine is not in a position to impose terms, nor has Russia reached anything resembling exhaustion. This outcome does not depend on Donald Trump, nor on rhetoric, nor on diplomatic theatrics. It depends on what happens on the battlefield. And on that front, momentum favors Russia. Zelensky then turns to what he believes is his final lever, the United States. He argues that Washington should increase pressure on Russia, framing Moscow as a spoiled child that must be forced into peace through coercion. Implicitly, he assumes that Donald Trump can compel Vladimir Putin to accept terms unfavorable to Russia. This assumption misunderstands both power and timing. The longer a conflict continues, the less leverage outside actors possess. Russia's leverage grows with every territorial gain. Trump's influence, like that of any mediator, diminishes as facts on the ground solidify. The best deals are always available early. Late deals are shaped by defeat. Russia also retains the option to ignore diplomacy entirely and continue military operations. That option alone defines the negotiating balance. If Moscow does not like the framework presented, it can simply reject it without meaningful consequence. There is an additional irony here. Years ago, Ukraine was promised unwavering support for as long as it takes. That promise was made when Ukraine's strategic position was far stronger than it is today. The lesson is unavoidable. Prolongation has worsened Ukraine's position, not improved it. Zelensky's call for stronger sanctions and larger weapons packages repeats the European playbook that has already failed. Europe imposed sweeping sanctions, sent weapons, and escalated rhetorically, and in return, it excluded itself from meaningful negotiations. The talks now involve Russia, the United States, and Ukraine. Europe is absent. Even Emmanuel Macron has implicitly acknowledged this failure by suggesting that renewed dialogue with Vladimir Putin may be necessary. Representation matters. Those who remove themselves from diplomacy do not shape outcomes. Ukraine's intelligence chief has added another layer of contradiction by claiming Russia plans to attack the Baltic states within a few years. This claim directly conflicts with the simultaneous narrative that Russia's economy is on the brink of collapse. Both cannot be true. Wars require manpower, equipment, logistics, and above all, money. If Russia's economy were truly disintegrating, it could not sustain a prolonged conflict in Ukraine, let alone prepare for confrontation with NATO. The contradiction is obvious and unresolved. Assertions that Russia behaves like an empire expanding for expansion's sake fail under scrutiny. Empires must finance occupation, suppress resistance, and manage hostile populations. None of this aligns with the claim of imminent economic collapse. Finally, there is the issue of frozen Russian assets. Some European figures continue to argue for their seizure to finance Ukraine. This idea has already failed politically and legally. Opposition from financial institutions in several EU states remains strong. The proposal collapsed once and shows no sign of revival. At the same time, transatlantic unity has visibly eroded. Europe was comfortable under the previous U.S. administration. With Trump's return, that comfort has vanished. The gap between American and European priorities is now undeniable. What remains is a strategic stalemate defined not by balance, but by denial. Russia advances methodically. Ukraine demands outcomes it cannot enforce. Europe insists on relevance it has forfeited. And the United States recalculates its interests in real time. This is not a tragedy driven by misunderstanding. It is the predictable result of power colliding with illusion. The war will not end when slogans change. It will end when reality is acknowledged.